My name is Ann Kinseth, and I'm the Director of Education at the Meadows Museum. And welcome to Learning at Lunch. We're so happy to have you with us this Friday afternoon. And even more thrilled is to have Dr. Wendy Sepponen join us today for this afternoon's talk. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Sepponen. She's the curator for the Dallas installation of Alonso Berruguete, first sculptor of Renaissance Spain. And she began working on this exhibition 5 years ago as a curatorial fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., before she came to us at the Meadows Museum, where she was our 2018-2020 Mellon Curatorial Fellow, which is a role that she just concluded at the end of September. So it's an absolute thrill to see her back again so quickly for this afternoon's talk. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Wendy Sepponen.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Anne. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to sort of go on this journey behind the sculptures. I'm just going to dive right in. Let me see. There we go. So behind the sculptures, I'm going to take an approach to that title that is both literal and figurative. So literally, we're going to look at the backs of the sculptures, or some of the sculptures anyway, not all of them. There are far too many, and entertain the question, well, what do the backs of these things tell us? And then I can also take a figurative approach, which is much more kind of broad, macro, qualitative, where I'm hoping to give you some curatorial insight into the kind of invisible behind the scenes aspects of the sculptures, including in one case, how they were installed. I'm hoping at the end of this, you can walk away understanding how these sculptures were made, and then also what it took to install them. It took a lot, spoiler alert. So I'm not sure how many of you have had an opportunity to visit the exhibition so far, so I'm going to take an opportunity to just take a few minutes, either by way of introduction or reminder of what the show is, what the exhibition is about, and kind of the main drive of it. So it's Alonso Berruguete, first sculptor of Renaissance Spain, is centered around the drawings, paintings, and mostly sculpture, but also some architecture of the artist Alonso Berruguete, who was born around 1488 in northern Castile and died in 1561 in the city of Toledo, Spain. He really made his name professionally, both during his time and then in the subsequent 5 centuries or so, as a maker of altarpieces or retablos, massive, sometimes multiple story high constructions that blend architecture, painting, and sculpting. The main thesis of the exhibition is that Alonso Berruguete was really the most innovative designer of the 16th century in Spain. And by designer, I want to underline the term designer and consider the usefulness of that term in and of itself. Designer helps us actually, in my mind, understand Alonso Berruguete better than just the term sculptor. What did it actually take for him in terms of artistry and artistic practice to generate sculptures like the one we see on screen right now and the one that opens the exhibition, The Sacrifice of Isaac? To be a designer was to be the head of a workshop, the person who was ideating, conceiving, designing both the figures, the composition, the overall retablo or monument or tomb monument, what have you. And that required him to be skilled in multiple arts simultaneously. So designer is a term that's capacious enough that to hold both his role within his workshop, almost as the head of the workshop. We don't actually know the degree to which he physically carved the sculptures that are on view in the exhibition. So designer lets us leave room for the historical unknowns, while also paying tribute and respecting the work that he did do as the kind of conceptualizer and manager overseeing the production of these works. Another thing that the term designer and what it says, the contingent points that the term designer makes about his role and his artistic identity is that it opens up the question of, well, who made these things? How were they made? And these are questions that in the installation in Dallas, we really tried to encourage with a number of curatorial decisions. Just raising the really essential question around the facture making and process that brought these works to life. We made very early on the curatorial decision to install as many sculptures as possible in the round. And I hope it's not tooting the Meadows horn or my own horn too much to say that this is kind of groundbreaking in some ways, because the figures you see on the screen at the center, to my knowledge, it is the very first time, possibly even historically, that these works have been on public view in the round. They were not in the round in the first venue of this exhibition in Washington, D.C. These three figures were leashed to the wall, understandably so. In Valladolid, in their home institution of the Museo Nacional de Escultura, they are, again, on a shelf against a wall. It's impossible to see them fully in the round. We worked with our designer to fabricate this pedestal that they're on. Our exhibition designer, the glorious Julie Herrick, worked with a mount maker to specifically design the mounts that you see. I hope you can see the mouse. These mounts were custom made. They're bespoke mounts for each of these little figures in order to both support them, but also to allow 360-degree visual access to or around the sculpture. And again, this is a decision that we're making to encourage people to wonder or to look in awe about how these works were made. It's worth noting that this is not how the sculptures were meant to be seen. I, as the curator, am kind of breaking away from history and taking advantage of the opportunity to see them in the round, but that's a process of dislocation and decontextualization. So to give you an idea of where they originally would have been, I'm showing you two images. One is a reconstruction here of the original altarpiece that these works come from. It's the altarpiece of the Benedictine monastery, San Benito, Saint Benedict, San Benito el Real in Valladolid. It has since been dismantled and moved to the National Sculpture Museum. But here we have a reconstruction where you can see essentially this is one of a bay or a section of the altarpiece, which we have loosely reconstructed physically in the exhibition space. So these sculptures would have been, as you can see here, placed in niches. And they were made with the very careful eye that they would not have been visible at the back, that they only would have been visible maybe 180 degrees, maybe a little bit more, kind of coming around the edges, depending on how far the sculptures kind of stuck out from the niche. And you can get a sense of that from the backs of the sculptures. And because they weren't seen, they didn't have to be completed in the round. They, as objects, preserve a lot of markers of how they were made and kind of the operation. We can start to reconstruct historically the operations and processes used by his assistants in the workshop. So let's get to that a little bit because it's very exciting. I know I'm nerdy, but you guys are here in a midday on a lovely Friday, so I'm assuming you're equally nerdy in that respect, and we'll enjoy some of this. So this is how they kind of were meant to be viewed, very frontally or perhaps from an angle. And I want to, as an example, hone in on the Saint Christopher, which is the figure at the right. and use the St. Christopher as an example to think through, well, what are the lessons that we can learn about these workshop operations and about studio practice from these objects and how they're installed, and then eventually from their backs. So Berruguete was trained originally as a painter, not as a sculptor. He's the son of a very, very prominent and prolific and successful and wonderfully talented painter named Pedro Berruguete. So I think when you're looking at his sculptures or the sculptures produced by him in his workshop, these are painted sculptures. And so it's always worth looking very closely at the painting and the way the painted surface is treated. In the St. Christopher, you can see, I'm going to use my mouse again, there's carved garments, there's actual sculpted garments, but then there are also areas of painted garments where the polychromy of the flesh tone was completely finished. And you almost get the sense that one of the Benedictine monks came up to him and was like, excuse me, sir, there is entirely too much flesh on this saint. You gotta cover him up. And you can see, I hope, that someone basically, whether it was Berruguete or someone he sanctioned within the workshop, it's still sanctioned by him, so expressive of his design and his approval. You see here on the thigh, this is not carved, this is just painted on the surface. Here in this little peekaboo where there used to be a whole lot of hip and a whole lot of skin, it's painted and covered up. Here in this deep V of the drapery, which again used to be just torso, painted over. If the upper arm was a bit too salacious, again, painted over. So that's something from the front. That's just a kind of insight that I think is very compelling and worth looking at. There are also details always, 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 like here, whenever you see the seam of hair meeting skin, someone has almost always gone in with a paintbrush and painted hair, almost like baby hairs, in addition to the actual sculpted hair. So really lovely attention to detail. But to sort of start us on this pivot to looking behind the sculptures more specifically and literally, I want us to hone in on this detail here, which is the kind of drapery that comes off of his proper right hip and he seems to be holding in his proper right hand. Well, it turns, from the front, it looks pretty homogeneous with, thanks to the polychromy and the gilding, it looks homogeneous, it looks cohesive with the front of the sculpture. But when you see it from behind, and I hope this detail is big enough on the screens you're looking at, you can actually see this is a rag. It is not wood. It's just a scrap of cloth that was hanging around the workshop that instead of taking the time to carve wood, add it, join it, glue it, wait for the glue to dry, then polychrome it, that's costly, that takes time, that takes labor, that takes material, extra materials. And the fact that they used cloth, let me see if I can get my mouse back. Here we go. You can see the warp and the weft. You can see this is a fully finished rag because you can even make out the seams that run along the edge here. Oh, nope, sorry. That was an errant click, apologies. But you can see the warp and weft of the cloth that was used. They basically took cloth, dipped it in gesso or glue, then modeled it when it was still flexible before the glue and gesso dried, and modeled it onto the carved wooden form, and then let it sit there and dry. Once it's dry and hardened, they could go in from the front and polychrome it, paint it, gild it, as though it were continuous and cohesive and homogeneous with the wood. So from the backs, we can already see that, wow, Berruguete and his workshop are working very improvisationally. You would think that in a high-functioning, highly successful sculptural workshop, that they would have the design figured out, the composition blocked out, they would know exactly how much wood they would need, they would assemble those pieces of wood, carve it down, zing, zang, zoom, you got a sculpture. I'm being facetious, that's actually very time intensive. But this is actually the zing zang zoominess. They are slapdash. They are working quickly. They are under a lot of pressure to produce a lot of sculptures in a very short amount of time. Well, actually not a very short amount of time. This took about for 7 years. But when you consider the carpentry of the architecture, the painting, the architectural detail, each one of these things has to be produced with maximum efficiency. So this is where you can start to see, when you look at the backs of the sculptures, exactly what lengths they went to save on time and materials. What else can we learn from the backs? And here's a lovely install shot from the members opening. From the backs, you also get a sense, so here's the detail I was just showing you. You also, especially with these two figures, get a sense of the assembly of these works. How many pieces of wood did it actually take to make a sculpture of this size? And here we can see yet again how slapdash essentially some of the assembly and production was within the workshop. You have these bits of wood here. It almost looks as though, you know, they started to carve it. Maybe it was too wonky. Maybe it started to tip back too much. They were like, add wood, just add a piece in the back. No one's going to see it. Boom, there you have a piece of wood. In this central figure here, you can see this is a separate piece of wood that's been added. This hip is a separate piece of wood that's been added. So they're filling out the composition in kind of roughshod ways. From the front, we never would have known just how rough and quick and ad hoc the process was in the workshop. But by giving access to the back, it hopefully provokes these questions and answers some of them as well. So here in this case, in the Banco figures, which again, we purposefully installed in the round, we wanted to make sure we laid bare some of those hidden stories and histories of the workshop practice. But these are not the only works in the exhibition where you can see signs of assembly. They are the only sculptures, in addition to the Sacrifice of Isaac, which opens the exhibition, the only sculptures where you can see that as a visitor. But here now, because we have the advantage of PowerPoint and we're not in the gallery space, I want to show you some other examples that I took during installation. So here is what our designer Paco calls the wow moment, which I hope some of you have had a chance to appreciate in person. But I want us to focus on the figure of the Virgin Mary and the figure of Saint John. I want you to take a second to think about, well, maybe how were these sculptures made? How many pieces do you think they were? What do you think they look like at the back? Are they a bunch of little blocks? Is it a bunch of big pieces of wood? Think it through. I'll give you a couple of beats. And now I'll show you. So here's the back of the Mary, and here's the back of the John. And you can see, hopefully, the size and think of the weight of these things. These two sculptures are the heaviest sculptures in the exhibition. The wonderful art handlers, some of whom you can see in my very shoddy iPhone photos, can attest. These things are heavy. And you can also see the kind of treeness that is still preserved in these sculptures. You can make out knots in the wood. You can see the real big grain. Again, here are more knots. And you also see then how you go from assembly at a smaller scale to this mode of assembling wooden sculpture at a grand scale. Not all of the works, sorry, I'm trying to get my mouse back, here we go. Not all of the works are assembled. There are some examples where the sculptures have been made genuinely only out of one piece of wood, at least as far as we can tell. A lot of these, most of these, in fact, I think only one of the sculptures in the exhibition has ever been X-rayed. So there's a lot left inside these works between the front and the back that we don't know about yet. And hopefully we can come to that kind of technical analysis eventually, but that's a project for maybe another day. Here we see the St. Augustine, which is in the lower left-hand corner of the reconstruction, or the reconstruction of this section that's in the exhibition. And here you can see pretty uniform piece of wood, gouged out probably for weight and also to keep the wood more stable. This is not the only example of where only one piece of wood has been used. The more surprising example is actually in this sculpture group, which is the three central reliefs from a side chapel in the Church of Santiago Apostol. Each one of these, remarkably, was carved only out of one piece of wood. So this is one piece of wood, this is one piece of wood, this is one piece of wood. The reason this is so remarkable is wood, actually, before I go on to that point, I want to show you the backs. This is what we're all here for anyway. Here are some shots that I took during installation of the back of the relief that you see there at left. These are remarkably one piece of wood. Now, when you are carving wood, think of the big tree trunk, and this is maybe where you can look at me. If you can see me in the Zoom box, I'm going to be gesturing a lot during this section. So you have a trunk, okay? Trees are not like marble, where you have a block and you can kind of just carve into it. You have to basically slice a trunk almost like a mango, because the interior core of the tree, called the heartwood, is very unstable. That is the center from which the trunk in the tree expands and grows. So it's the most unstable. And we all know from like trying to open doors when the humidity and temperatures change, that wood, even if it's been cut down and dried out for years, still has the habit of expanding and contracting. So you want to try to minimize the potential damage that that kind of natural liveliness within the wood might do to the finished work of art. So it's very unusual to have a tree that is so large in diameter that even without using the full width of the diameter, even when you're cutting around the heartwood, that you can get 3 pieces of wood this large for these reliefs. It's really remarkable. And I hope is something that you can appreciate even more when you're in person there, and you can appreciate the change in scale, or just the scale of these works. So here you can see that they have taken some pains to carve out wood from a number of these from these areas, especially behind the heads. It's really rather remarkable, and I think is a very strange trick of the eye, where you go from, you know, this fully resolved, oops, sorry, I keep doing errant clicks, apologies, from these fully resolved faces, where as soon as you start to kind of come around them more, they turn into just absolute shells. And this is partially to make the wood lighter. It's also, the thinner you can make the wood, the less, the more room you give the wood that's there to expand and contract. The more, it gives it more negative space to kind of breathe and move into. So it actually makes it more secure. Now I want to show you the rightmost panel or relief in this group, and the back of it, where you can see again the heads are carved out. They've kind of carved in to try to take away some of that extra volume. And I'm a real sucker for tool marks. I love looking at tool marks and thinking through the size of the chisel they were using, the angle they were hitting it at, and using the backs or any marks of the tool as kind of, you know, breadcrumbs in a trail that leads back to whichever hands were doing the labor and producing these works. I also love this detail here of the hand, the back of this beautifully finished hand. It's actually not quite so beautifully finished. It's just very roughly carved when you see it from the back. And I have a detail of that in my closing slide, so I'll be sure to point that out. In my last kind of chapter here of my talk, I want to go kind of behind the sculptures in a more curatorial sense, to give you some insight into how these works were installed. You know, I've been seeing this exhibition getting some press because of the really remarkable lengths we had to go to after the almost 6-month delay due to COVID-19. Really how it was really kind of extraordinary that we were able to work with our collaborators and colleagues at the National Sculpture Museum in Valladolid to install these absolutely massive works and enormously precious works. We installed virtually using Zoom and WhatsApp. Truly, I think like the kind of technological story of 2020 is everyone's using Zoom, and we used it to full advantage in the installation of these works. We had curators from the Sculpture Museum on an iPad over Zoom. I had earbuds that allowed me to communicate with them. And we took it very easy. It was a great pace. We started early in the morning and ended midday because we also had the time difference to contend with between Dallas and Spain. And it was a real, I think, achievement. It was stressful. It was at times overwhelming. It was completely gratifying. But it took a team of 4 art handlers, a team of 3 curators at the Sculpture Museum. It took me, our exhibitions manager, Julie Herrick, our collections manager, Anne Lenhart. It was really all hands on deck to make sure that these sculptures were installed safely and also beautifully, which I hope you're able to appreciate. So here, and I have to say, full disclosure, this is a video that I'm hoping will play. It did not work during our run through. So I'm just gonna let it kind of, technology take its time and do its thing. Let's all keep our fingers crossed that it decides to kick in. But I'm gonna just keep talking and explain what went into this sculpture in particular. And again, everyone fingers crossed that technology works for us. So this is size-wise the largest sculpture in the exhibition because the sculpture and the cross are together. They are not integral, but they are mounted together. So you cannot kind of hang the cross first and then hang the sculpture on the cross. They have to be done as a unit. The work was so large that we could not fit the crate that it was inside the galleries. We had to open the crate down in the basement of the museum. We had to fabricate a special cart for it to hang on its side like this, for us to roll it into the freight elevator and into the gallery space. This was quite the diva, I have to say, of the exhibition. Really very high maintenance. It required special rigging machines and forklifts in order to install it. And unfortunately, the video is not playing. Keep your fingers crossed. But you can see right up here is where those are basically the tips of the forklift. And we secured and protected the cross with a lot of not off-gassing, very safe for art cushioning materials. It was then tied up and rigged to the 2 points of the forklift, which we were then able to use to raise it so it could clear these steps here. And you can see we've already kind of marked out where we want it on the wall behind. And the forklift then lifted the rigged sculpture, and then we drove it basically right into the wall. And it was really amazing. I really wish this sculpture, this video was working. It makes it look like you think it wants to work, but unfortunately it is not. But this took, it was really quite, it took quite a lot to get this up and in. Overall, it took us 4 hours to install just this one sculpture, and a team of about 5 art handlers, including a specialist in rigging. So this day we had, the moment we knew we could move forward with virtual installation, we booked this day because we knew it would be the most intense and the highest stakes, and also require the most specialized art handling. So even if we could move if we actually moved faster than we were anticipating, which was great. We love efficiency, but unfortunately this date we could not move. We could not be flexible or kind of move this date around just because of the specialized materials and equipment that it took. And now, there we go. Oh, sorry, I did not mean to move that quickly. Just by way of conclusion then, I think I only have a couple of more minutes before we transition into the Q&A. There's a lot to see behind the sculptures if you are able to come and see the exhibition in person. My hope was that I could not only signal those points to you if you come to the exhibition or come back to the exhibition, but also give you some special insight that you cannot see when you're there, that kind of continue the theme and the story of how these sculptures were made and what it took to get them up in front of your eyes here in Dallas. So with that, I guess, Kinseth, I'll open it up to questions, but here are a couple of other details where you can see they started to carve. This is one of the Sibyls here, you can see, but they started to carve and they were like, no, why are you carving? It's not gonna be visible, stop, stop, stop. And then this is the back of the hand of that pointing magi, or magus, I guess, the king, in the Adoration sculpture group. So questions, please, I'd love to hear them.
Wendy, thank you so much. I just want to quickly review how we're doing questions because I think some people joined us a little bit later. So there are 2 ways to ask a question right now. One is just to use the chat box. The second question, or the second way, because this is meant to be a slightly more interactive program, is if you would like to unmute yourself, what I'd ask you to do is first raise your hand and I'll be scrolling through and I will call on you. And at that point, you can unmute yourself to ask your question. So we will give you a moment to either raise your hand or type into the chat box. Okay, Howard.
Wendy, how prolific was Berruguete? Are there collections all over Spain, or is the work that's in Valladolid the sort of the center of Berruguete's oeuvre today? Can you comment on that, please?
I would love to, Howard. It's nice to see you, and thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, in terms of importance, the San Benito Altarpiece, which is in the Sculpture Museum in Valladolid, is kind of considered his masterpiece in his work in the field of altarpieces. So it's central in that way, but it is by no means the extent of what survives of his work. There are, like with the Santiago Postal reliefs, that is still an altarpiece that exists in situ. If you go to Valladolid, I encourage you to. It's a great town, great tapas, great sculpture museum. Hit me up for recommendations if you ever go. You can still go into that church. You turn the corner. It's along, if your back is to the main altar, it's in a side chapel along the left, and you can still see it there today. Right now, obviously, it doesn't have the central sculpture group because we have it, but it's still there, so you can still visit that. His major monument which I'm of course biased towards because I wrote the essay on it in the catalog, is his choir stalls in Toledo. So his work in the choir in the Toledo Cathedral, still there. A number of his other altarpieces are still present and extant and totally visitable. There's one altarpiece in a convent in Toledo that I've never been able to see because unfortunately that convent has been shut down and the nuns were relocated to a different convent. And so nobody's there to kind of open the doors or let you go see it. So it's kind of just aging there, unfortunately. They still exist sort of throughout Spain. Some suffered damage during the Civil War. Some of that damage was repaired, some of it wasn't. There's another great spot in Toledo, which is the Hospital Tavera, where he did his last major monument, which is the tomb monument of that Cardinal Tavera, which is really, really quite an accomplishment, really a beautiful work. Still has signs of damage from the Civil War. But yeah, he was very prolific. San Benito was definitely the biggest altarpiece he ever did. It is considered his masterpiece in that field, and is no longer one of the rare examples where it's no longer in situ.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank
so
you.
We have two people interested in the type of tree, or I suppose the type of wood that were used in the sculptures. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, so this is a great question, and I have suspicions, but I do not have confirmation. So as I was alluding to in terms of the x-rays, there's a lot of technical analysis that has yet to be done on Berruguete sculptures in particular, but Spanish polychromed wood sculpture generally. You know, Pine wood is a very typical kind of wood because it was more or less widely available. It's quite soft. It's good for carving. It's not good for architecture because it is so soft. It's not like a kind of strong oak, but it can be very, very good for sculpting. I have a suspicion that the Santiago Apostol reliefs were carved out of an imported northern oak, just because trees that size, it really shrinks the pool of possibilities. It's a question I have been meaning to ask Manuel Arias, basically the global specialist on Alonso Berruguete and curator at the National Sculpture Museum in Valladolid, because if there have been technical studies on it, on the variety of kinds of woods that he used, both in this altarpiece and throughout his career, it hasn't been published. I really want to know, and it may even be that the sculptures in San Benito or that populate San Benito, the San Benito High altarpiece, it's possible that they use different kinds of wood for that. It's this kind of sustained study that has yet to be undertaken. But again, these are the questions that these objects provoke.
Okay, so Mary is curious about process. Can you talk about, if there were studies or sketches or anything preliminary done before the actual carving began?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mary. And you're picking up on all the right threads that just selfishly, curatorially, we tried to lay out for everyone in the exhibition. So we know that Berruguete used drawings to communicate to his workshop and also for his own kind of individual artistic practice and preparation and process. Now, do these kind of workshop drawings still exist? Not really, no, they don't. Unfortunately, it's possible that he used sculptural models, so things like clay or wood. I think, though, he probably did mostly use drawings because when you look at these sculptures and you study them from both the front and the back and the sides, you do get a sense from them that they are really made kind of from the front back. That the front planes are more finished, more cohesive, more resolved, But the moment you move into and around that sculpture, a lot of details like the wheels basically start coming off the wagon. So there are, say, you know, entire appendages that just like are left untouched. Like, for example, the opening sculpture of the sacrifice of Isaac, the crouching figure of Isaac has like his body basically ends at his left knee. Like he has no completed body, which to me speaks to a kind of flatness of conception, right? That you're not accounting for every single strata of a three-dimensional object, that you are starting from the front back, in a way that I think does maybe indicate that people were working from drawings where they only had like a certain kind of depth that could be communicated in the draw, the pen, the wash, things like that. So drawings were essential to the process, and probably very widely used within the workshop.
Okay, I'm keeping my eye on time, and I think we have 2 more questions, Wendy, that we can have you address. So Lourdes wants to know if there's ever been damage to the sculpture caused specifically from installation and deinstallation, whether it's the wood, the gilding, you know, any aspect.
Yeah, so it's really from installing, I mean, these things have not really moved very much, and they are frankly in really good shape. They were moved in the late 19th century from their home in San Benito in that church to the Sculpture Museum. I don't know if anything sustained. We know that there are architectural pieces that have been lost as part of that, you know, you dismount it, you move it, you kind of put some things in storage, you put some things on view. Over the intervening, say, 150 years, some of those pieces have been lost. They may still be clanging around the storage, somewhere in storage in Valladolid. I'm not sure. As far as I know, they have not been damaged. It is completely natural during the aging of these things that they will lose, say, some of the gilding, that just due to humidity, the various layers will start to separate and crack or fall off. You know, that's very common. And if you look very closely, you can in fact see that the gilding is not as pristine as it was kind of day one when it was on view. That's natural. That's not really because of deinstalling, reinstalling. That's just the natural fragility of these objects. So they really are in remarkable shape. And the most damage that's been done to them has unfortunately been caused by, it's been man-made. It's been war. And not necessarily installing, deinstalling.
Thank you. So we have one final question, also kind of about the mechanics of these pieces. So Akemi is curious about, you know, when they were originally created, how were they installed? How were they put into altarpieces? Were they sent separately and assembled in the church? Did they come fully ready to go?
Yeah, thanks, Akemi. Hi. Yeah, great question. So they were definitely made in pieces and assembled on site. And if you go to the Sculpture Museum in Valladolid, because they do preserve a lot of the original architecture and carpentry that was used to, say, set in, there are some sculpted reliefs or paintings, right, on panels. So everything's wood backed. And you can actually walk around some of the wings of the altarpiece and see that basically almost like the back of a frame. I'm looking for a picture frame around me. I don't have one. How you have these kinds of like hooks that kind of like swing down or like brace something from the back. That's kind of what was used. They also use things like chains, nails, wire to kind of like leash things together. But it was definitely made as independent pieces and then assembled together. So the level of kind of like architectural specs or engineering and manufacturing specs is really quite something, because everything needs to fit together perfectly, but also work and be movable and transportable independently.
Great. Well, Wendy, thank you so much for this, I mean, fascinating look, I think, at the exhibition and at the sculptures. And I mean, I also have to just thank you for really your stick-to-itiveness and the beautiful exhibition that I am just over the moon that it happened. It's at the museum right now. It'll be up through, I believe, January 10th. And if you haven't seen it in person, it is itself an experience. It's stunning. So I hope that you have a chance at some point to come and view the exhibition. But Wendy, thank you for everything that you've done for today and for your entire 2 years with us at the Mellon, or at the Meadows Museum. And I want to thank everyone for attending this afternoon. I wish you all a fantastic weekend, and I hope that we'll see you at more of the Meadows Museum's programs. So take care.
Thanks, everyone.